Thank you. Thanks. My 3 questions for graduate students is always, what do you want to know? How are you going to find it out? And how would you know if you're wrong? And it's that 3rd question that's the most important for you to answer, because I see a lot of presentations where people feel like they already have the answer and then they just need to do the research to get to that answer. I have a lurking positivist in me that worries about that. So I think if you can provide frameworks for explaining how would you know if you're wrong, and that's a methodological point, it's really, really important, because studies wouldn't get published if they're an obvious endpoint that there's bias throughout the study. So apparently I'm a self-nominated social justice warrior. I'll wear the badge, that's fine. I'm happy to debate an alt-writer about that all day. That would be fun. So it's a pleasure to be here at UEA. I've been here a few times, and I spent 22 years at Essex working in the Department of Government. We tried to rename the school as the Department of Political Science, and people threatened to resign if we changed the name. These are funny games that academics play. But I had a great run at Essex, really enjoyed it. It was a great place to learn political science, quantitative methods, qualitative methods. I taught in the summer school, comparative politics, etc. I'm quite broad church in my methodology. If you can answer those 3 questions, that's good. I'm not particularly wedded to quantitative, but I have spent some time working on that. I also benefited from the Human Rights Center at University of Essex, where I got to work with some of the leading UN human rights experts and learn a lot about the field, but also try to bring human rights into the study of social science more forcefully, out of law into social science, and spent 10 years working the American Political Science Association on the human rights section, which now has about 430 members. And at the annual conference, there are panels and papers on human rights, and they're not all quantitative either. So when I left Essex and went to Nottingham, I was looking at a broad-based faculty of social science. We have 10,000 students at Nottingham in our faculty, which is bigger than Essex used to be when I was there. I think at one point Essex was fewer than 8,000 students, so it was quite a step up in scale. But with that scale came a diversity of disciplinary approaches. So suddenly I was joining a university that had a faculty of engineering, and as you'll see later, geospatial experts. We have medicine and pharmacy, natural science, brewing, vet school. We even have a working dairy on one of our campuses, business school, etc. And in our faculty, we have 7 schools spanning from law to education, and a variety of methodological approaches as well. And we're now developing a Methods and Data Institute that will be cross-faculty. We're now a Q-STEP center. We just got the letter from Q-STEP about that. We were an affiliate for a while, but we really invested heavily in new posts and people and programs, and the Nuffield Foundation have now made us a Q-STEP center. So we're very pleased with all of those developments. So we continue to develop our programs. We have about 680 staff in the faculty, about 450 of those are research active, and we have a lot of PhD students across our pathways. The Midlands Graduate School is made up of Warwick, Birmingham and Nottingham, Leicester, Aston and Loughborough, and we meet like you do around our various campuses. So I get to tour around all the different campuses in the Midlands and work with colleagues on that program. So what I'm going to share with you today is, to me, a kind of what I've termed in an article in the Human Rights Quarterly, rigorous morality. And this is the idea that you can do values-based research. I think we had a discussion about that earlier this morning, and it's really important. I looked at the projects that are being done from George's work in Folkestone up to the work in China on the way in which girl-child representations take place in Chinese popular culture. I think you're pushing on the edge, right? This cutting-edge work that you're doing, and you're not just pushing on the edge of methodologies necessarily, but also the boundaries of values, morals, the moral compass, and issues that concern you because you're concerned about what you see in the world. And for me, rigorous morality is having that values-based approach. Goes right back to Max Weber. He said you can still have value-oriented research, but you can be rigorous about the research that you do. And actually, the more rigorous you are, the more defendable your project is, and the more you can show how you would know how you were wrong, actually helps you carry your argument, because there are a lot of people out there that don't like social justice research. They don't like the cutting-edge values-based research. And if they can find a hole in your method or your results, then they can dismiss you and say you are rubbish. And that's why I insist on having good method, good research design, and to be absolutely rigorous against your own perspective and make sure that your argument is landing the best way it can with the best evidence possible. In the human rights field, this is more crucial than ever. I've spent time traveling to about 49 countries now working on human rights problems. And in the data space, there's a lot of worry about the quality, validity of data and the ways in which we use it. And this was highlighted in the work I did on truth commissions, where truth commissions in the past simply asked people questions about what happened to them in the past. The problem is that if you have 22,000 people come forward and tell you a story, WordPerfect isn't going to do it for you, right? A word processing software isn't going to do it for you. You need some sort of disaggregated structured database approach to looking at how people represent things that happened to them in the past. And the work that's been done over the last 20 years really caught my attention. And I evaluated the data work that was done in the Peruvian Truth Commission, for example. And when the number of estimated deaths came out, it absolutely changed the conversation in that country. A, the number was 3 times higher than people thought it was. B, they didn't know what the indigenous racial component of killing rates was, nor did they know about the geographical distribution of violence in that conflict. And those findings then changed the conversation that Peru was a country that didn't know itself, that the Sendero Luminoso was more responsible for killing than the state, which was something the popular discourse did not appreciate at the time. And there's still ongoing debates about what happened there. I was just at a conference in Buenos Aires 2 weeks ago where we had people from working on Holocaust studies and virtual victim and survivor augmented reality projects to people who suffered through apartheid, people from Peru, Colombia, Northern Ireland, and many other sites still talking about those periods of trauma, and a discussion around silence, representation, and the use of statistics. So it's a really interesting field to be involved in. And what I'm going to share with you today is one aspect of work we're doing at Nottingham through what we call the Rights Lab, which I have written up here behind me. So a number of years ago, our university wanted to see if there were kind of peaks of excellence that we could identify within the university structure in which we could invest and sort of accelerate research in those areas. So we had an internal competition. About 21 bids came forward, shortlisted to 11, and then eventually selected as 6. And we were fortunate enough to make a strong case for working on the issue of modern slavery. We had brought some modern slavery experts to Nottingham, and there was a building community of scholars interested in the topic. What was more interesting is that we were able to talk to people who had never worked on slavery before and say, actually, the approach you take to analyzing problems might be of interest to us in the modern slavery area of work. So we now have engineers and natural science and computer scientists working with us who had never thought about the issue, but had a bag of tools that are applicable to the problem. And that's what I want to share with you today, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. So, first of all, is the challenge that we've identified, and again, numbers are kind of critical to the challenge, and the numbers themselves are estimates, and the statistician in me always wants a margin of error around the estimate, and sometimes organizations like the headline, if they don't publish the margin of error, they just give you the estimate. But in any case, work by the International Labour Organization and a group called Walk Free, based out of Australia, on a sort of 2-yearly basis, try to estimate the total number of people involved in what they call modern slavery. And I'll talk a little bit about the concept of this in a moment. And they estimate that currently the rate is about 40.3 million people in modern slavery. So that's the size of California. And that size population is probably the 3rd or 4th largest carbon polluter in the world. So the people involved in activity, extractive industries, charcoal production, deforestation, a number of other things, textiles, fisheries, etc., have a carbon footprint that's 4th in the world and a population the size of California. It's just that they're distributed around the world. The distribution, of course, is highly skewed. There's some countries with massive prevalence and some countries with near zero. This country has its own prevalence problem, and you'll see that the Modern Slavery Act and a lot of the work being done by the National Crime Agency, the National Referral Mechanism, the Home Office, the police, and NGOs around this topic are working very hard on addressing the problem here in Britain. We think it costs about, or it's about $150 billion industry per year. It is predominantly female, 71% female, 25% are children, and 38% are in what we call forced marriage. There is a great abolitionist movement. We sometimes call it the great fourth wave of abolitionism that's not particularly well coordinated and highly competitive with itself And I'm really interested from a sort of social movement theory perspective about how unified this anti-slavery movement is. And different languages are being used. So in the United States, they tend to use anti-trafficking, sex trafficking, which of course is hitting the news now with the Jeffrey Epstein story. And in Europe, there's some use of trafficking language, but also this conception of modern slavery. That's not an uncontested usage either. So those that work on historical and transatlantic slavery think this is a misappropriation of the term. But I'll explain a little bit about the definitional challenge and some of the legal parameters that have been worked on over the last 30 or 40 years. So it's a big global problem. It's also, it manifests itself in the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll show you in a moment. The 1926 Slavery Convention has arguably been called the first international human rights instrument. So coming out of the 19th century, the abolition of slavery, and of course Brazil doesn't get rid of its slavery until 1888, prohibit slavery, 1888. Mauritania did not make slavery illegal until 1991, I think. So it's still a problem. And despite the legal prohibition against slavery, it still exists. And data that we have through our legal team that's been collected and coding all anti-slavery legislation in the world across all UN member states shows that 43% of countries have not actually made slavery criminal. So it's prohibited, but it's not criminalized, which means organized criminal activity can still take place with no prosecution. So there's a lot of work to be done on the legal side. This definition is one of those consensus definitions that came from a series of scholars and stakeholders working on the idea of slavery, which now is known as the Bellagio-Harvard Guidelines on the Legal Parameters of Slavery. Chattel slavery of pure ownership, in which there's a contract that you sign that you actually own someone, has been abolished. But the treating people as if they are property still takes place. So people held against their will, they're not free to leave their place of work, they're not paid, there's some coercive, intentional denial of their agency for labor exploitation is taking place across the world and here in the UK. So some of the popular examples here in the UK include things like nail bars in local towns and villages, car washes all over the place. If you drive to a major supermarket, you'll see a car wash facility. You can get a car wash for £6 with 6 people while you do your shopping. And we've run some agent-based modeling to show that that cannot be profitable unless they're not paying people a fair wage or any wage at all. And oftentimes you go to these little disused gas stations outside a town or a village. You can get your car washed for the same rate. You might notice that when you drive up to get your car washed, someone makes a phone call, someone comes in on a bicycle and they wash your car. So we were worried about this. We partnered with the Kluwer Initiative, which is a faith-based initiative here in the UK to fight modern slavery, and we designed an app for people's phone. So when they get their car washed, we have a set of questions that they can answer, and those are sort of markers of modern slavery, which then get sent to a national sort of hotline clearing desk that then looks at the veracity of the claim itself. Big chains like Tesco suddenly got worried. What were they allowing on their car parks to be allowed to operate here in the UK? There are darker forms of slavery taking place in this country. There's agricultural work, block paving work, a whole range of informal work, and we're working on trying to produce heat maps and sort of risk profiles of the UK based on publicly and privately available data. So the condition of a person over whom any or all power is attaching to the right of ownership or exercise. This is a very specific use of language, and it captures this idea as if somebody is property. And there are many different ways in which people are held against their will. A promise is made to come to the United Kingdom, papers are sacrificed at the border, you have to work a debt to get your papers back. That's a classic case of sort of indebted servitude or debt bondage in some way. There's inherited debt bondage that takes place. You're born into a family that is already working for a perpetrator or a slaveholder, and it's expected that you will work for them as well. The culture that wraps around some of these practices will find a slaveholder and a victim of slavery sitting in the same village circle, and the slave will say, this is my owner. So there's an open acceptance of that culture and that practice. So it's not a simple fixed problem, it's a very deeply complex embedded problem that we're seeking to address. So it's also part of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 8 talks about decent work and economic growth, but within that, Target 8.7, take immediate and effective measures to end modern slavery. So we have joined with groups in the UN to seek to end modern slavery, at least use research to help end modern slavery. So we work with the United Nations University and Delta 8.7, which is a sort of sharing platform out of a small group of social researchers in New York. And in February, we were at a conference called Code 8.7, where we brought technology firms, NGOs, UN people, and academics all together to talk about how we might use machine learning, computational social science, and AI to address the problem of modern slavery. And that's really the derivation of this talk today. Now, I'm drawing on work that's being done within the Rights Lab, and in particular work done by Professor Doreen Boyd, who's in our School of Geography, who has given me her blessing and her graphics. So but we can talk about how we came together to work on this. And she's published a number of papers that are open access about this topic, some of which I reference here today, so you can follow up if this interests you. So, in the history of anti-slavery, from the 1990s to 2015, this sort of fourth wave of anti-slavery, there's been a series of short-term solutions. If it really is 40 million people, you would need to liberate 9,000 people a day to get to 2030 of people not being in slavery, 9,000 people a day. And that doesn't take into account the new people falling into slavery. So from a mathematical perspective, it feels like a bathtub problem we used to get in calculus, which is you have a bathtub filling up at one rate and draining at another rate. So if there are people falling into vulnerability and falling into slavery, there are also people coming out of it. And what's the rate of change there? And how would we have policy intervention and financial intervention and research intervention to actually empty the bathtub? And that is a huge global challenge. So much so that some people think it's an intractable challenge of sustainable development, that it's a laudable goal but might be impossible to achieve. But because I'm a social justice warrior, I'm not going to give up on that particular outcome. I think we can make a very positive contribution with the work that we're doing. And only this week, the government announced a new £10 million consortium of universities to address the problem. So we'll be working with the Turing Institute, with the Bingham Institute, with the Wilberforce Institute, and with the University of Liverpool in a joint effort to address some of these questions. So what's the problem? 40 million slaves worldwide, a UN global goal to end slavery, and we are trying to construct what we call a freedom blueprint. So what's the roadmap for reaching a slavery-free world is our big question. And that's what we pitched to the university, and we've had an inward investment from our university research strategy to kickstart this process with the expectation that we then use that to attract more funding, more researchers, and growing our group. So far, we have about 100 academics involved in the Rights Lab and a core administrative team, as well as a network of early career researchers and research assistants that help us. And it's across all 5 of our faculties. So we have a Faculty of Arts, Social Sciences, Engineering, Medicine and Health Sciences, and Science. So it's a big effort. And as you know, working in universities, that effort across faculties and across schools can be, shall I say, challenging. But we're getting there. Okay, so our research questions are 5. How many slaves and where? This is almost a quantitative question. So we want to know how many there are. Prevalence estimates are difficult. I've just been writing a new piece on how to measure modern slavery based on the human rights work that's been done. There are no easy solutions. There's no easy way to do this. And interestingly, the Global Fund for the Ending Modern Slavery, which is a joint Home Office and U.S. State Department fund, would like a prevalence measure per country, and they think you can achieve it for $50,000 per country, just to give you an idea of the thinking there. I think that's probably impossible. I think this is such a hard to find population that, knowing what I know from truth commissions, et cetera, there needs to be a much bigger investment. And what I'll share with you today are some of the lateral approaches, at least to locating where we think slaves are rather than how many. And maybe the how many question is elusive. Maybe that's the wrong question, but at the moment we're motivated by at least attempting to answer it. The geographical distribution is also of absolute critical importance to us. If you're going to intervene, if you're going to use NGOs, they need to know where to go, what to do, who to speak to, etc. And there are all sorts of sensitivities around that work. So the more precise we can be geographically, the better off we are. Why does slavery persist is a much bigger socioeconomic question. So what are the root causes of slavery, and how does it persist over time? For me, I have a kind of big model in mind with, sort of a pool cross-section time series data set. There may be big cultural models and maybe a whole range of other things that people could do to address this. And we have endless debates in our groups at Nottingham about how to address that particular question. The third question is what underpins anti-slavery resilience? One of our sociologists, Alison Gardner, has been working, she actually did her PhD on precarity in Britain and the response to precarity and austerity, but she also worked for local government. So she had an insider's view on how local government works or doesn't work, the funding streams that comes into local government, and how that responds to the problem of precarity and austerity. And she then flipped her question to how can a local city become quote unquote slavery free? So what are the assets that sit within a local community, a city like Nottingham, for example, that would allow it to be resistant to or resilient to the problem of modern slavery? So what are the things that need to be in place, and how can we make cities slavery free? Her work has attracted attention of Bergen in Norway, Melbourne in Australia, and now she has British Academy funding to pilot her work in Brazil. The Brazilians are really keen on this issue, and they have really good ideas about how to address the problem. And Alison's work is very much community-based, very much on-the-ground participant observation, action research approach. And she is now what we call a Nottingham Research Fellow for the next 3 years, will be funded to do this work alongside with the BA grant. The fourth question is, how do we close the implementation gap? If 43% of countries still haven't made slavery criminal, how do you close the gap between the promise of law and the practice of law? And that's a social science question as much as a legal question, or at least a socio-legal question. That's very much at the heart of the research that I've done on human rights. It's one thing for countries to ratify human rights treaties. It's another thing to actually implement them and protect rights on the ground. And so that implementation gap is very important to us. And finally, what difference does freedom make? Which is to say, if we flip the question around, if we do actually get people out of slavery, what's the overall contribution that people will then make to the economic activity within a country? There's an assumption that cheap labor is good for business, but that's not necessarily the case. And highly productive, free, active people who are in control of their own agency actually is good for business and good for a national economy. But we need to show that that is the case through our evidence, and I think that's an interesting set of questions for us. To give you one example, we're launching a report next week on a cost-benefit analysis of extending the number of days the British government supports to victims of slavery. At the moment, if you are referred into the national referral mechanism, you get 45 days of support from the British government. And that includes housing, mental health assistance, translation services, legal services, a number of other things. And the Victim Support Bill, which is led by Lord McColl, wants to extend that to at least a year. And we were asked the question, what's the net benefit or cost of doing that? So we tried as best we could with the available data that we have to look at the overall pattern of benefits, the overall pattern of costs, and then see what the net calculated difference might be. And we show in the report that actually there's a net benefit to keeping people in care for longer. Interestingly, that became part of a legal case that was used against the government, who wanted to defend the 45 days. And so 2 weeks ago, the case was decided, and part of the evidentiary base came from the work that we've been doing at Nottingham. So we're pleased that we can make that contribution. Just to give you a little example of some of the things we're doing. Okay, so within the Rights Lab, we have a data and measurement program. And so there are many different strategies for measuring slavery as there are for measuring human rights, which consist primarily of events-based data, of actually counting things and people and who did what to whom kind of models that have been quite popular in human rights literature for a very long time. There's also a standards-based approach, which uses international legal standards and then coding frames with coding teams that sort of code country performance against those standards. And there are a number of examples, for example, the political terror scale or the Chinganelli and Richards data set on human rights have done this for a number of years. There's a survey-based approach that you can go and ask household survey questions, not necessarily directly about slavery, but you can ask lateral questions about family structure and size, whether you're free to go to work, whether you come home at night, do you have control over your economic activity, etc. And the Walk Free Foundation, working with Gallup, have developed a number of surveys they implemented over about 48 countries and 70,000 respondents to get at that kind of vulnerability mapping, if you will, of people and their propensity to fall into a condition of modern slavery. Beyond surveys, then, we also have socioeconomic and administrative statistics. We can look at all sorts of things. We also have new forms of data. And today I'm going to share with you sort of a new form of data, or at least a lateral use of data that is emerging as a quite fruitful way of experimenting, of examining the problem. I'll give you two examples, our Slavery from Space program, and also I'll be talking a little bit about social media analysis. It's a new project I've started with a sociologist from California called Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, and one of our business marketing analysts in the business school named Benjamin Lucas. And I'll just give you some proof of concept things at the end. So the Slavery from Space project started initially when I got to Nottingham. I thought, we have a School of Geography and we have a Geospatial Institute. And I wanted those two to talk to each other. And in the past, apparently, they used to talk to each other, and then they stopped talking to each other. And what you find in large institutions is you often get silos and turf wars and all kinds of stuff that develop. And so I wrote to the head of the Geospatial Institute, and I booked a meeting. And he thought, why is the faculty PVC coming to see social scientists coming to the Geospatial Institute? And so I just sat with him and I said, what do you actually do? And he said, well, we do phone analysis. So the building itself actually has a concrete pillar through it that keeps it fixed on planet Earth, has a train track on top of it that you can put phones on, and you can do things with those phones, run them around on the train because you can see all that from space. So you can actually monitor the movement of phones and track phones. The challenge is people use what's called spoofing and spoiling. So they tell you where they are when they're not really there, or they absolutely block your ability to see the phone. And the big challenge is to see whether your phone is observable from space inside this room. So if we all just take a moment and smile for the satellite shot, just making you feel a little bit paranoid there. So I have seen demonstrations of mobile phone analysis in large malls in Beijing where you can see people moving about. For a business purpose, it's great because you can watch footprint, you can see where people shop, and you can do your pricing model in the mall about who gets what space where by where the footfall is. And if you have a heavy footfall place, you got to pay a bit more to have your shop there, that kind of stuff, right? The dark side is this is monitoring of citizen behavior, right? So the civil liberties element of this is quite frightening. And in all technological advance, there's good and bad uses of tech, and we could probably talk about that in our Q&A. So that was one piece of the work. The second piece of work they do is Earth observation. And this was a term I hadn't heard before because I'd spent my whole life working in sort of socio-legal, political science circles. And this is about using satellite imagery and remote sensing techniques to look at trees and forests and rivers and silt buildup and rock movements and mountains, etc. And Doreen Boyd is also famous for finding the world's tallest tree. And that was published a month ago. Just imagine that. Could you find the tallest tree on planet Earth? She found it and has a 3D model of it, etc. So they use drones, they use satellites, they use remote sensing technologies to look at things that are of geographical interest. And I said, have you ever looked at people? I said, no, we've never looked at people, right? And I knew that George Clooney had funded work for Amnesty International to look at South Sudan conflict. I knew there was work on Sri Lanka looking for mass graves from space. And the basic intuition of Earth observation is that any human activity could potentially leave a trace on the Earth that is detectable from space. So that was the starting point. What I've learned since then, there's a company in California called Planet that takes a picture of the entire surface of the Earth every 24 hours. Again, just take a moment. Right? And moreover, they have automated systems that monitor the images that are coming in, looking for anomalies. So if they see something like that, the satellite might pause, or the code might say, that's an anomalous thing. We're going to send a higher resolution satellite to that area to take a closer picture. And they do that with AI. Okay? So there's not a human saying, ooh, that looks a bit weird. They actually code their satellites to recognize anomalies in what they see. The head of Planet was at the UN with us, and he showed us pictures of deforestation almost in real time in Brazil. So you could see roads being built over a period of days and months. You could see forests being cleared. Because they're taking a picture every 24 hours, you're getting this kind of time-lapse progression, or regression in the case of deforestation, of things unfolding. And that gives us a set of tools that the anti-slavery research community would find quite useful. So you see here in this digital globe picture, you can actually see a picture of a boat. You can start to look at cargo holds. You can look at the physical qualities of that boat, and you can start to identify some practices. The boat's tied up against a boat. You might find 4 boats tied together. Often in the fishing industry, certainly in the Philippines, the Work of Freedom Fund has identified that young men are promised high-paid jobs if they just go out to that boat and do fishing. Once they get on the boat, they're not allowed off the boat, and they're not paid. So there's a coercive element to attracting people onto vessels like this where they are not free to leave. So be careful what tuna fish sandwich you have later, because think about where that might come from, as well as the clothes you're wearing. So we brought our research together from the School of Geography, the Geospatial Institute, and our slavery experts, particularly Professor Kevin Bales, has been working in this area for a very long time. And he said, there's one project we could start. It's that I hear reports out of Bangladesh that there's a problem. This is actually a UNESCO protected cultural site in Bangladesh that should not have, should we dim the lights maybe? It's movie time. Is that better? Okay, great. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see what looks like some sort of set of structures. This is a UNESCO protected cultural heritage site that should look like this. Okay? So it doesn't. So this raises question of some anomalous set of practices going on there. It turns out those are fish drying racks and fish production facilities that have sprung up in that area. In the absence of state capacity to regulate this area, or authorities to regulate this area, or any other combination of factors which might lead to this being allowed to be built there, you can actually see it from space. And this was published in a story in the Telegraph and the FT. You can see here another development of infrastructure, the fishing drying racks along the water source here. Okay? And so satellites at least allow us to begin to identify anomalous structures. But that only tells you part of the story. We then work with NGOs to do some of the ground truthing, as we call it, which is they actually go to the ground and see what is taking place in that region. And here you see kids working on the fish drying racks. And then that is evidence that there is a questionable practice here. And further research is required on what's the status of those kids having got there, how did they get there, how were they recruited, how old are they? You just have to look at them and know they're not of a legal working age. And that then leads to advocacy. So the project in Bangladesh was a proof of concept that we could see things from space, we could connect that with ground truthing from NGOs, and we could design interventions that would help people. The second pilot was in India. The brick kiln industry is one of the highest users of slavery. We think it's probably 70% of those in the brick kilns. These are simple factories that produce bricks, and I'll show you their structure and shape in a moment, because it turns out their structure and shape is absolutely crucial, the way in which AI can detect these structures in what's called the brick belt. So it is a prominent practice in 14 nations. We started our work on Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. It's a huge area called the brick belt. It just stretches right across the region. It's an informal industry, and the slavery occurs in the digging of clay, putting the bricks within the little molds, and then firing the bricks and transporting the completed product. So throughout the sort of production cycle, you find that there is a high probability of the people working there are enslaved. So Kevin Bales' field research, there's a book called Blood and Earth that he published a few years ago, where he actually went to these brick kilns and spent time with the workers and in the local villages and communities that surround them. The Freedom Fund organization has a series of hotspots where they have a set of interventions where they try to get people out of this work, and their interventions have been evaluated by Harvard, and they roughly estimate they have a good success rate of 20 to 30% reduction of people working in this area. Okay, so how do we use, where does AI come into all this? Well, you can see that the brick kiln has a particular shape. It's elliptical in shape with a very large chimney for the smoke from the kiln to come out, and then stacks of bricks that are being made on the outside. It's big enough to be observable from space. Satellite technology now can see something the size of a postage stamp. Those are the satellites we're not allowed to use. So the three organizations that produce the most images of Earth are the United States government, the Russian government, and the Chinese government. The fourth largest organization is Planet in California. It's a Silicon Valley company. But the degree of resolution is what's crucial to this story. So Google Maps and Google Images produces about a meter by meter degree of resolution. And the challenge for any remote sensing project is to avoid what we call the type 1 or type 2 error in statistics, which is I'm trying to find an object that looks like this, but I need to make sure that I don't find a roundabout off the M25, right? I need to find a brick kiln. So we can hone in on the geographical area, but we need to correctly identify the brick kiln from just a basic road structure. So that's training a computer to classify the object properly. And there are techniques for doing this that you rotate the images and set boundary conditions and take samples, etc., which I'll share with you in a moment. But that's the intuition that hand coding all of this would be a monumental task. Can we use computers to go through vast numbers of images to correctly identify the presence of these brick kilns? And that was really the essence of the Slavery from Space project. So here you can see the weak resolution, but even within that weak resolution you see the 3 ellipses, which may or may not be brick kilns. So the challenge for the research is to correctly identify those as brick kilns or not. And that draws on techniques that have already been developed. So if you can find the highest tree in the world, or the tallest tree in the world, you should be able to use the same methodology to find these brick kilns. So the intuition is absolutely the same. So now you see something with greater resolution. You see that there's a brick kiln there, there, and there. You see the chimney sticking up. It's a very distinctive feature. You see the elliptical shape and the clearing of land around that. So that's a fairly easily identifiable set of brick kilns from this Google Earth image. And here's another less resolute image, and finally a better resolute image. So you can see how if you can improve the resolution, then that's a higher quality piece of data than you would have otherwise. So the challenge then was to say, how could we use statistical inference to count the number of brick kilns, knowing that they're there and knowing that we have some confirmatory evidence from satellite data? So the first step was to use a random sampling of high resolution data and visual interpretation. So if you take the whole brick belt, you divide it into cells, and then you take a random sample of those cells, and you count the number of brick kilns in the cells that you have identified. You can then make a statistical estimate to the cells that you have not identified. So it's like taking a sample of the population, asking them a question about anything, and then using basic sampling theory to make an inference back to the population. This is just doing it geographically and doing it in an object-oriented way. And then we tested the reliability of the visual interpretation via what we call citizen science or crowdsourcing. So we used the Zooniverse platform, where random pictures would be generated on the screen, and users from around the world could log on and say, I think that's a brick kiln, I think that's a brick kiln, I think that's a brick kiln. The data that they supply by just trying to interpret what they see then allows us to check the accuracy of the interpretation, but also for the next piece of work actually allowed us to train computers to go find those images in an automated fashion. So this, we had randomly sampled areas from the entire brick kiln, and then made the citizen science Zooniverse platform open so people could log on and they could have random pictures shown to them, and then there was a tool where you could just click on what you thought was a brick kiln. And it was that simple. And that just gave us sort of crowd information of a sort of a validation kind of tool to make statistical inference thereafter. So the problem here is you have a small settlement where slaves are housed, but also the brick kiln next to them, and the clay fields where the bricks are laid out to dry. And so all of that becomes of interest to us, but the key thing was to find the elliptical shapes in the first place. So the first article on this came out with Boyd, Jackson, Wardlaw, Foodie, Marsh, and Bales. They're all at Nottingham working in the lab. There's a mix of senior professors and early career researchers, people just finishing PhDs and starting postdocs. Stuart Marsh is a professor of Earth observation. Doreen Boyd is an ecologist and environmental scientist. Kevin Bales is a slavery expert. Bethany Jackson, Jess Wardlaw are both early career researchers, and Giles Foodie is a professor of geography. So they all came together and put this together. So the article actually tells you how the Zooniverse worked. It tells you how they did statistical estimation to the whole brick kiln. And they found that NGOs at the time thought there might be 10 to 12,000 of these brick kilns, but the statistical estimation showed it's more like 55,000. And this resonated with me because in Peru they were saying we think 22,000 people died, and the estimate was well over 60,000. And that changes the conversation. It changes the conversation about justice. It changes the conversation about the scale of the problem you're trying to address. And I think this is a first step, if you will, in addressing this question. So this was the first statistical estimation that was used. Doreen then said, I think we can use machine learning and artificial intelligence to apply to this problem. And Giles Foodie, professor of geography, also agreed, and the two of them got together to think about how one might do that. So for me, it is a form of statistical inference. Machine learning and artificial intelligence takes data that we already know and looks for data that we don't know about, or does something with data that we can't do by hand because of the scale, the size, and the shape and the structure of those data. It's predicated on training sets, which is establishing a smaller data set that the machine can learn from and then extrapolate out to new forms of data. The extrapolations and predictions are basically binary models, at least in this, which is to say, is that a brick kiln or not? So it's a probabilistic model of looking at whether that's been correctly identified or not. The thing you're trying to avoid is the false positive, identifying something that's a brick kiln that isn't, or the false negative, which is not identifying something as a brick kiln that actually is. And that's a classic problem in statistics. It's a classic problem in human rights analysis of over and underestimating hard to find populations. It is an emerging area for human rights work. So the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in California and my colleague Patrick Ball out there has used machine learning and AI to find mass graves in Mexico based on data that he knows, extrapolating the data that he does not yet know. They use machine learning to estimate the number of people killed in the conflict in Syria for the United Nations. And there are different forms of machine learning. There's supervised and unsupervised. And they realized that the unsupervised was not particularly good. They had to supervise it because they were getting really strange results. They worked with NGOs and then retrained the computer to go find reports, etc. He's also doing a project now on perpetrator voice on phone text. They have a phone text database of perpetrators of human rights abuse and drug violence in Mexico, and they're using AI to kind of mine the text of that communication. So it's applicable to many forms of complex and large data. So for show of hands, how many of you shopped at Amazon in the last month? Okay, so did I. What happens when you shop at Amazon, right? You pay, you hit click me. I hate that button, actually. I turned it off because it makes you spend more money, which is the idea. But once you get something to your house, you think about it, you buy the product. A robot goes and finds the product in a distribution center by unique barcode. It brings it to a little box, puts everything in the box, and then a human checks the box, and then it goes out the door and it gets to your house. Sometimes, literally on the next day, even if it's a Sunday, you get it, right? So you like that as a consumer. A few days later, you get an email that says, "Ooh, you bought this. Would you like that?" That is not a person. Right? Not a person doing that. There is a machine plumbing and mining your entire purchasing record and comparing it to everyone else's purchasing record and looking for matching and saying that since you like this CD by this person, I won't declare your musical interests, you might like this one. It is suggesting things for you. It's the same thing when you go onto Facebook and you think, oh, I'm getting a bunch of ads for watches because you've been searching for watches the day before, right? And that makes you a little bit frightened because you think someone's watching me. That's the whole deal. When you sign up to Facebook, it's free. You sacrifice your own identity to do that. And if you don't want to do that, get off Facebook. But the tech under all of that is AI and machine learning, and they're constantly trying to perfect the way in which they feed you high quality information that makes you more likely to buy, right? And the same thing happened with the 2016 presidential election, I think. I don't have buyer's remorse, but some people might. Okay, so applicable to many forms of large data. And as I say, you're trying to avoid the type 1 and type 2 errors as much as you can, and that's where you're looking for confidence intervals, you're looking for sampling strategy, sampling frame, and all the things that you study in postgraduate research training programs. So this is one version where there's sort of a heat map or count data on the whole region that Doreen and her collaborators have produced. And this is actually a time series plot of their work in the state of Rajasthan in India. So you can actually date the brick kiln because they pop up quickly, they're easy to make, and they're identifiable from space. And so what Planet was showing me about roads being built in the Amazon and deforestation processes taking place, Doreen and the team in the Rights Lab have worked on identifying brick kilns over time. And so the time series chart here, and the neat thing is you can go back in time because the reservoir of images are there, right? So Google images, etc., go back in time. All you have to do is mine the previous images that are taken and then move up through time over this period. And you can see the variation in time of the brick kiln industry rising and falling over time. And all of that was done by machine learning and application of artificial intelligence. So the question is then, what else can we do? So we can continue the work on brick kilns. We're working with NGOs on the ground who use our geolocated data to make interventions and work with their programs. There's a potential to scale that up with more funding. There's a whole range of things we can do around the Global Challenges Research Fund and other donors who may be able to help us in our work. Cotton turns out to be one industry that's historically and contemporaneously a problem for the presence of slavery. There are state forms of slavery that are sort of seasonal, that states mobilize people to go harvest the cotton. And then there are non-state forms of this practice as well. And we're looking into how we can apply these things to cotton. Charcoal making in Brazil is something that's observable from space. Here you see a charcoal farm that's observable from space. And Kevin Bale's work from Touring Brazil in Blood and Earth talks about the intersection of violence, criminal activity, slavery, and human rights abuse around these remote areas of production. So this is literally in the middle of nowhere, and the inability for state agents to regulate what's happening here and protect people's rights is a problem. But we can see these sites from space. We're doing some brick kiln work in Cambodia. You'll note that the shape of the brick kilns is completely different, so you need contextualized local knowledge to tell you what to look for. There's other examples of, I think I have a slide here of mining. Some mining sites, because miners are being sent underground a couple hundred meters for a few days at a time. In order for that not to erode from rain, they put these big tents over the hole. Well, the tents are observable from space, so they're these blue tents that we could see everywhere, and that tells us where these mines are, which is quite an interesting idea. Democratic Republic of Congo, also mining, so open mining, panning here. This activity, whenever you disturb the surface of the earth in that way, if again you have local knowledge that tells you what to look for, then we can analyze images. And what's happening is the image companies are just giving us their images, because a really good high-res image can cost up to £5,000 a picture. Planet are willing, through their kind of social responsibility angle of their business, to give us free images. So the next developments then are to apply machine learning to a range of data, forward monitoring using satellite data with other data sources, so we can use mobile phones. We're looking at some dark web activity, financial data, as well as UAVs, which are, it's a gendered term, I'm afraid, unmanned aerial vehicle, which is a drone, supported by ground observations and a monitoring system for prevention. So if we can go in proactively and say this is something that has a high probability of going all wrong, then are there things that can be done from an intervention side, and understand the different related aspects. So how does this link to environmental destruction? What are the other things and other dimensions of interest to us in doing this research? So the Slavery from Space project is ongoing. I think the support we're getting from European Space Agency, from Planet, from other our stakeholders and partners has been really, really positive. There have been some critical stories about the project as well, misplaced in my view, but we could debate that. We're just going to keep plowing on with the work because there's tremendous support for it. The final piece I wanted to share with you is this idea of the discourse of anti-slavery. I went to a conference at Yale last year, and I was struck by the dissonance in the room between different voices who were all brought to a conference to talk about the same thing. So I thought they were equally motivated by the social justice issue, but they had different reasons for why they thought the problem existed and different targets for the sorts of things they wanted to actually do. So there's a large community of people think that you need to destroy global capitalism to get rid of the problem. And there are others who think you can do a kind of a state intervention approach or NGO approach. And this goes back to the debates within the Green movement, the Fundis and the Realos. The Fundis were saying we in Germany, absolutely don't engage with the state, live in communes, absolutely separate identity, grow a commune and live off the land in a very sustainable way. And that's the way you bring about a green future. Whereas the realists said, actually, we need to recognize that state institutions' power and money matter, and we need to engage with those institutions' power and money to make real change. And I think that debate is affecting the anti-slavery community. The use of language is also problematic. Is it trafficking? Is it slavery? Is it this? Is it that? The Home Office has a typology of 17 different forms of modern slavery. Well, if you're trying to measure it, that's pretty tricky. I've got a typology of 17 things I got to go find, and it starts to get really complicated. And there is an issue around definitional clarity, operational strategies for measurement, and then the data analysis you do that falls out of that. And that's the kind of area that I've been working on in human rights. It's of great interest to me. But that led me to think there's probably a really interesting project in how does the anti-slavery movement talk about itself, and is it actually a social movement or not? And I've worked at Essex on social movements for a number of years, and I'm really interested in the sort of framing question as well as the resource question. So how much resource do you have? How many people do you have? But how do you frame your demands? And I was really influenced by a book by Clifford Bobb called The Marketing of Rebellion. And he compared successful and unsuccessful social movements in Nigeria and Mexico, and said that one part of that story was about how one framed the struggle. And I think this framing concept is really useful for us in this particular area of work. So I got together with Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, who wrote a book called What Slaveholders Think. He actually did on-the-ground in-depth interviews with Indian slaveholders over a long period of time. That book was published, I believe, 2 years ago. And out of the blue, someone from the business school wrote to me and said, I'm a data analyst from the NLab in the business school. Can I come see you? Yes. So we started talking, and the more I listened to him, the more I realized that he would be someone that I could work with to do things that I can't do, which is to say, he says all data is structured in some way, and even if it's big data, it has structure to it. It's just bigger. So he's done some proof of concept work with the two of us, looking at how the anti-slavery movement talks about slavery. So this is 8,000 tweets in one day, I think, that he looked at, or 8,000 tweets in 1 week. And the blue and red are different discourses coming from different nodes in the Twitter feed, talking about two concepts. So he did a hashtag on human trafficking, and you see it intersects with the hashtag on modern slavery. And so it tells us that there's a structure to the way people are talking about things, and that structure is both organizational and discursive. And I'm really interested in the interrelationship between the organizational and the discursive. And if you want to have a successful movement to end this problem, then disparate discourses may not be the best way of going about it. A kind of unified discourse might be another way, or at least less contestation than there is currently. So I think this is a little bit fruitful area of research, and it's something you can't do by hand. So you can parse out the structure of that and look for nodes and tributaries and other things in the data. So again, human trafficking and modern slavery, you can see how things spin off from each other. You see, for example, on the way to modern slavery, there's a little branch that goes off to human rights. And so what does that mean? And is the fragmentation of discourse unhelpful or not? And is there a way to defragment the discourse? And we think there's probably a lot of papers in figuring out what it is people are actually saying about what it is they want to change. And there was a whole bit of work by Emily Hafner-Burton in the human rights community about naming, shaming, and framing. And I think it equally applies to the discourse of anti-slavery. So here are some more nodes that can be split out, and you can see how granular you can get with the data to see where some of these, the origin of some of these uses of discourse lie. So, to finish then, why does all this matter? I think I've hinted at why all this matters throughout my talk with you today. First of all, the article that's critical about slavery in space says they're not actually measuring slavery. And I thought, no, we never said we were. You read the article, it says we're measuring sites that have a high probability of slavery. I think that's an important distinction. At the UN, we debated this direct and indirect measures of things. So as you know, as social scientists, there's a lot of use of what we call proxy measures. And there's a debate as to how proximate your measure is. Sometimes people use measures for all kinds of stuff, and you think, that doesn't look like it has much concept validity. There's a distance between the concept you're trying to measure and the actual numbers that you're using. So there's a huge debate around that. But equally, there is benefit, I think, to understanding some of these more indirect measures, not measuring the phenomenon itself, but the geographical place where that phenomenon might happen. And with hard-to-find populations of the kind that I've been working in, particularly in human rights violations, etc., a lot of those things happen out of plain sight. And the modern slavery piece, I think people talk about hidden in plain sight, that you may not know that the person you just paid for your car wash or your getting your nails painted or your haircut might actually be under a condition of duress. You just might not know that. There are markers and signals, etc. But I think this idea around direct and indirect measurement is crucial. It turns out in this country that all bankers, tellers, are trained to recognize suspicious activity. And in any given year, there are 780,000 suspicious activity reports filed to the National Crime Agency. And some of those might actually be a person being led by the arm into a bank teller station and putting a large wad of cash into the machine. So, and then they might do it at another bank and another bank. And there are opportunities to triangulate those data to see what's the pattern of suspicious activity across the financial sector. And then of that suspicious activity, how much of that is actually related to the phenomena we're interested in and how much of it is just other types of criminal activity, etc. So it's that thinking laterally about the available sources of data that are out there that might let us triangulate and hone in on the phenomena we're actually trying to study. There is a promise of AI. I mean, you laughed at the Amazon story. There's certainly a promise in commercial and financial terms, and fintech is a massive growing industry now, both in terms of the academy but also the industry itself. But as in all technologies, there's a dark side to all technology. We think that there's a great promise for AI on the positive side of the story in using it in the ways that I've demonstrated today. And there's a whole piece around, I think it was Bill Gates that said something, if you want to change something, you need to measure it. You can take that at face value or not, but there's a question around advocacy strategies. And if you can show change and you can show baseline calculations and how interventions make a difference, you will find in your careers, if you're ever bidding for money, you need a theory of change, a pathways to impact document, maybe even a log frame analysis in order for those funds to be released. Because the funder wants to know what is the precise difference you're going to make by your intervention and can you show it? So it goes right back to my first three questions. What do you want to know? How are you going to do it? And how would you know if you're wrong? And I think measurement is an important part of that story. Measurement and intervention interlinked, so not only is advocacy important, if you come out with something and say there are 40.3 million people enslaved in the world today as an opening line, that's a headline grabber, right? And equally, when people were saying there were this many people killed in Peru, that was a headline grabber and it focuses attention for advocacy. Equally, if you're able to do baseline calculations over time and look at how interventions make a difference, then you can demonstrate the utility of the approach that you've adopted. And we did a huge bid for the GCRF, and we had to have a whole theory of change, we had to have a whole log frame, we had to have Gantt charts, all kinds of stuff in there, kind of almost projecting and assuming what we thought our ability to make change would be and how we would know whether we made that change or not. For us, the AI measurement, all of that is part of the Freedom Blueprint. It's part of our 5 research questions. There's a data element to almost all of those questions, but it by no means is the final answer, and it's not the disproportionate size of what we're doing. We work with survivors, we do survivor narrative analysis, we've got all sorts of case studies, city-based studies, etc. But we think the data measurement piece is still a very significant part of our Freedom Blueprint. So if you want to know more, there are a couple of resources here. I run a podcast called The Rights Track. We've got 37 episodes now on that. It was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, ESRC, and now University of Nottingham. It's on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, I think, as well as its own site. There's a partnership on AI, which is a kind of growing organization in the US. Delta 8.7 is the electronic platform for anti-slavery work and data, hosted by United Nations University. And then Human Rights Data Analysis Group is probably the leading statistics and human rights agency and NGO out there. They're radically open access. They share their code. They share their data. It's a fantastic organization. So I recommend that you go there. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thanks very much for your attention. We have a question.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a question, but we are just having one common point.
Yep.
It is actually fascinating to identify those problems or those kind of slavery, but there are also some slavery that the UN already knows about it. So our point is actually how are those local governments engaging in this issue?
Yeah.
Unless the solution would be for them.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, all we're doing is identifying stuff through this work. then working with partners, and the engagement with government is the really tricky piece. Because if I were a Bangladeshi government official, I'd say, right? Either the problem doesn't exist or what you've shown me doesn't really constitute evidence. And you'll have an argument for 10 years about whether that's evidence or not, right? So if you think about the history of the United Nations and the way in which it works, there's certain things it's able to do in terms of putting pressure on governments and certain things it's not able to do. So when the ILO calculates forced labor statistics, they don't do it at a country level that they release in the public domain. They do it at a regional level, right? Because it's too politically sensitive. Whereas an NGO might say, well, we're going to release it at a country level, right? Because they have greater degree of separation from state power. And I think, any international relations scholar will know about how one interacts with state power and what's possible. The whole transnational advocacy network approach is really about how far you can go and how you can get governments to change, et cetera. Pressure from below, pressure from the top, et cetera. You said there are lots of forms of slavery the UN already knows about. That's right. And they knew there were problems in the brick kiln, but they didn't know how big or extensive the problem was. So by doing the work we've done, we've been able to show the true nature and extent of the problem in that part of the world for that kind of forced labor, right? And I think you just have to, in a way, lower the heat on the language sometimes when we write, that this is an inference about a small part of the world in one sector, right? So future work in mining, extractive industries, where does the lithium that runs your iPhone come from? Good question. Where's the cobalt that goes into your computer come from? How's your computer put together and where? What are the business supply chains? And interestingly, the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK requires all companies over 36 million turnover to file what's called a modern slavery statement, which is actually to say, what is that company doing to know that its supply chain is as clean as possible, right? And I remember Andrew Fagan at Essex saying, it's impossible to shop ethically because you can't know, I don't know where these came from, I don't know, right? And there's no statement because the company, I shouldn't say what they are, but they're a company that probably has over 36 million pounds worth of turnover. But, for those companies less than 36 million, no idea. SMEs, no idea what's happening, right? So I do think that government efforts like the Modern Slavery Act, that's being replicated in Australia. They've just passed their act through Parliament, and some of our people have helped the Australian Parliament do it. We had Malawian parliamentarians come to us to ask, how does one do this? How does one bring this legislation to bear in our own country? It's a very slow process, right? The target of 2030 is probably impossible, right? That's just around the corner. Yeah. But do you... yeah, I'll be back here in 11 years. So yeah. But the question is, does that mean you give up on it, or does that mean you just keep going, and that this is a political statement for 2030 because it focuses global conversation? We now know that universities are signing up to the SDGs. There's a movement in the UK to get universities to formally commit to the SDGs, all 17 of them.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
Yep.
Sorry. Yes. Yep. Sustainable Development Goals. Right. But that raises a lot of questions about what happens at universities, right? Really interesting stuff, like gender pay. Yes.
I found this talk extremely eye-opening because I come from Pakistan and just became a controversy a few years ago where the NGO started talking about it. I also come from Kuwait, that's where I was brought up. So my question is, as you talked about, out of sight and sometimes in plain sight, these are things that you can monitor from the space. So, for example, you can see patterns and you can see these structures. But what I am also interested in is what happens in the homes, because you have families who are working, like you have a middle class, upper class family, and for them the idea of having house help is very, very common sense, and it is not, for the family itself and for the people who are working, this idea that this person might be enslaved is not.
It's not on the consciousness, yeah.
I wish I did not have to admit it, but I do. I have been seeing people in my family where families were coming in, their children were working, and it was until 5 years ago I realized that something is wrong. Just because we treat them like families, we are barring them from education. And I had this conversation with my mom, and I said, why don't you send her to school? Because I'm going to school, I'm doing a PhD, a master's. My mom said, oh, that would hurt us in the house. So, you know what I mean? So how can we target these things Also, another point I would like to raise here as well is in the Middle East, where there's oil-rich,
Yep.
factories and stuff. They bring people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. At the same time, I have been a part of this conversation where I would go to the people and ask them and fill this survey, are you happy or are you not happy? And because I'm a Pakistani, they would say in their own language, oh, this, the food is awful. We sleep on the floors. There's 9 people in the same room. But when I ask them, like, say something, they would say, but we're happy because this person, the CEO, gave us life. We're able to send money home. So on their own level, there's kind of a denial. They don't understand this. Of course, they don't understand this idea. So how can we fix that? Because this is, you can observe it, but then there are things that are happening in the homes as well, which is very. They're very defensive about it as well. They don't want to admit that it is slavery. So
to answer the first question, this is a partial answer to a partial approach, right? So Doreen thinks that we could probably observe 30% of slavery activity from space, sites where slavery is high probability, about 30%. That leaves 70% that you can't see, right? So this is just one aspect of the work that we're doing. In the home stuff's probably some of the hardest. Absolutely some of the hardest stuff to find. And the cultural wraparound of that is very interesting. So what you were actually saying is there's a false consciousness there, right? And a lot of people who defend the practice will say at least they're eating, right? So that's like folks in my country saying, well, at least the slaves had places to sleep, right? They had a pretty decent life there. No, they did not, right? Read the histories, look at the documents, look at the conditions, right? Look at that. Don't even begin to talk about that, right? So I think you're absolutely hitting on a point. This question of the relative fortune of someone and the cultural defense of that system of division and hierarchy, right? In India, of course, the caste system intersects with this quite heavily. So Dalits are very much part of the enslaved community. We have a podcast with Praxis. Wasn't the last episodes with James Carcane from the UN, but there's one before that with Praxis, which is a NGO that works out of Delhi, and they do precisely this work. The other thing that happens is families are worried about where to get money for festivals and dowries and all that system. So someone will come in and say, here's a big pile of money if you come work for me. And that child will go work for that person forever. So the amount of money that's paid initially looks like paid work, but then it's worked off and then it's never replenished and the child is never brought home, right? So it's a gifting and a seduction. It's very alluring, right? And then there's a form of coercion as well. In terms of domestic servitude, there are domestic unions, domestic worker unions and a worker movement around that. I met some amazing people in the States that work with the tomato harvesters in the southeast of the US. And their strategy is to boycott. So they boycott Wendy's, the fast food chain, because Wendy's wasn't actually playing fair when it came to supply of tomatoes that goes into your burger. It's that simple. And that sort of collective organizing is quite interesting. And domestic workers are part of that movement, but hard to find, right? And deeply culturally embedded. Yep.
Concerning your India example, because you said that 70% of the brick kilns you mentioned use slavery.
70% of the people in the brick kilns are likely to be slaves, which is different, yeah.
How do you actually know that slaves are in the, not that they could be legitimate, I assume?
Yep.
Are you able to make that distinction at all?
Not unless you work with the local NGOs, right? That's where the ground truthing is absolutely essential. All this is a method of saying, here's a geolocation of something that needs further investigation. My favorite example is a bit dark example is that we had a house across our street that was a grade 2 listed house, and a group of people moved in one evening to rent the place. All the blinds went down, and for about a year there were cars coming at night. There was like people peeking out of the curtains, but we never ever met any of the people. So we phoned the police, and the police do a flyby and they do an infrared picture of the house, and it's like glowing, right? So that's the version of the satellite taking the picture. Then the police have to raid the property. So at 6:30 in the morning they raid the property and they find the whole place is a hydroponic growing factory for dope, right? And they did 100,000 pounds worth of damage to the house. The other interesting aspect of that is the only people in the house at the time of the police raid were the 2 remaining women in the back bedroom packaging up dope, right? So what are they? Are they criminals? Are they slaves? did they get the right kind of support when they were extracted from that house, or were they criminalized, put in prison, and then, lost in the system of justice, etc.? So the point is that this distinction, on the ground needs to happen on the ground. The police can fly over all of Britain and find glowing hotspots, but they need the capacity to go in and investigate, right? And I think that's just an interesting analogy of sorts, right? So this is an identification problem, and it turns out it was a difficult one, right? And it's worth researching from a kind of Earth observation literature point of view. But then it has a social justice angle too, which I think is quite interesting.
No, thank you so much. I'm very fascinated with your work. I did research in the south of Italy, in shanty towns, with making pictures. And I think I went there with the idea that, I would find slave-like relations in the labor and so on. And I do think that's what I found, but at the same time, from the interviews, it was really clear that they did not want to be labeled as slaves.
Right.
So a lot of the labor struggles were for labor conditions.
That's right.
Against and unfortunately, the government, which you might know, Salvini, has been using this frame, sort of the discourse in different ways. So they're saying they're slaves, so they need to be saved. And in order to do that, we have to dismantle the shanty towns, and we have to crush the system, putting everyone on the streets and not really helping at all.
Yeah.
And then there's the sort of criminalizing of the NGOs, so the trafficking, as NGOs are helping the traffickers across the sea. And so actually even human trafficking is becoming a bit of a sort of weaponized, instrumentalized term. So now I'm really feeling, so if you have any advice.
Well, you should read, is it Neapolitano's work, The Merchants of Men? Have you read this? Yeah, it's amazing, because she says the same routes that were used to, so after 9/11, the US shut down a lot of financial transactions, and the Colombian drug lords knew that trading in euros was better than dollars, so they needed a route to European market. So they used West Africa up through Middle East and North Africa into Europe as a trade route. When that dries up, that gets used by people movers, right? Same routes. So the book is Merchants of Men. She was a law enforcement person, I believe, but it's worth reading just for a different perspective. So nomenclature, framing, these are huge problems, right? The human rights community struggles with this all the time. There is the issue of false consciousness. There's also an issue of displacing the problem. So if an event, let's say we were successful in intervening in Bangladesh and got rid of that fishing farm, there'll be another one down the road in no time at all. So is it like squeezing a balloon, a water balloon, where you just squeeze one part of the problem and it shows up in another part of the world? And it takes that kind of coordinated action, I think, in some ways to prevent that from happening, but also replacement strategy. So, okay, let's say you squash the shantytown. What are you going to do after that, right? So is there a microcredit, microfinance system put into place? Does the household get a small investment to thrive again? Is there a local microbank that they can use? Is there a collective that people can come together and share a resource, for example? Is there a community resilience strategy that allows families to move out of exploitative labor relations into less exploitative, or even not exploitative at all? We're all exploited in some level, but it's all relative, isn't it? And I'm having a lot of struggle with just basic theories of structure, agency, and what tips someone into a period of intentional denial of agency. One of my colleagues said, well, if I lock you in a room, I've just denied your agency, but you're not a slave. I said, yeah, but you're not exploiting my labor, right? So there are really interesting theoretical questions about what's the tipping point. There are structural inequalities in society that make people more or less economically free, and there are political constraints that make us more or less politically free. But is there a threshold over which we say that is absolutely unacceptable? And I was challenged by a CEO of a company. He said, when does somebody know they're not a slave? And I thought that was an interesting question. And he also said, at least they're going to work. He did at least they're going to work and earning something. There is a question about whether they're free to go home, etc. So yeah, there's a burning set of many, deep sociological and social science questions that I don't think are being sufficiently asked and answered at the moment, and that's why I think what we're trying to do is open up that conversation more.
Yeah. I think you touched on this a little bit in the previous answer, but I was wondering where, although you might not want to take on you said the destruction of global capitalism.
Well, I just think the probability of that's pretty low, but
but still some kind of global economic conditions might make more fertile ground for things like modern slavery.
yeah.
And I was wondering where your work sits in that context.
Yeah, so I'm working on a piece at the moment about globalization and modern slavery, because there's a strong critique that the drive to the bottom, the race to the bottom, the hyper-competitiveness, the technological change and everything else is and the growing human population, right? This is another thing that's interesting. The actual price of a person has dropped so much because of the growth in the population, which is a crude statement, but empirically probably true. So what I was interested in, is there a relationship between openness, trade openness, FDI, measures of globalization, etc., and slavery prevalence, which some of the best measures we have, which are not brilliant. So there's lots of caveats around this. So we have data for about 70 countries, and I've run a series of models for trade openness, FDI, and just per capita GDP, alongside political and legal institutions. And it turns out the economic ones don't matter, and the political ones really matter. So it's about rule of law, good governance, solid institutions, transparency, and those sorts of things. And it almost harks back to some of the Amartya Sen work. Whether you believe it or not, there is no famine in a democracy. Whether that's empirically true or not, I think the intuition is that in a country where there is a modicum of free speech, open, transparent governance, it's difficult to allow a whole bunch of your population to starve to death, right? And that intuition to me is interesting for this area of work. And maybe I don't disaggregate the elements of globalization properly, right? So it might be a sectoral analysis that's required. So is it about textiles? Is it about fast fashion? Is it about fisheries? Do you have to get down to levels of granularity of the sorts of things that are manifesting themselves through globalization to get at that question, or global capitalism, call it what you may. That might be a next step that needs to be taken. But on aggregate measures, we don't see that those countries that trade more have worse problems with slavery. In fact, the opposite is true. The more open you are to exchanging with other states, you get all of the other things that come with that, diffusion of values and institutions and other things. But democracy and human rights protection is actually much stronger predictor for low prevalence than the economic variables. Currently revising the article. Some of the reviewers didn't like it, so I got to go back this weekend and keep working. But that will come out hopefully soon in the autumn.
I guess picking up on that, this current attack on the global governance and international organisations, and how are these, the danger to the enforcement of human rights if that system collapses is very real, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Trump administration's announced a new committee on unalienable rights. And I think it's going to go right back to a very narrow definition of civil and political liberties, narrower than we've ever seen. And all the work that's been done on economic and social rights will be lost in one fell swoop. And they'll probably stack the deck with some really interesting characters on that committee.
Plus the Brexit withdrawal from the European rights conventions.
Yeah, and I was talking about that earlier, because the Great Withdrawal Bill takes all European legislation into the UK legislation, but then over a period of time, things can be redlined. So, and that's the worry I have, is that a lot of the protections, social protections, et cetera, that we enjoy, precisely because the EU will actually be taken out because they're expensive or not popular. Off topic, but there you go. Don't say the B word.
I only really recently learned about the alleged complicity of NYU in the construction of the Abu Dhabi campus in terms of forced labour.
Right, NYU.
Yeah.
Right.
I didn't know. So basically, I found about it in the last couple of weeks. Do you know if that's a really isolated issue, or whether there's a wider issue with the increase in satellite campuses of the complicity of the sector globally?
Wow. How do I answer that politely? There are a number of things I can't say because I've asked these very same questions. So satellite campuses are probably on the wane, I would say, because they're economically difficult for universities, particularly in the funding environment in which universities are finding themselves now. That's one thing. Second is universities find themselves as guests in host countries, right? And one approach that is taken is, as a guest of the host country, we abide by the host country local custom and practice, right? But if you are a global social justice warrior, you might want to challenge that. So you might want to challenge the impulse to do the activity in the first place, or now with the Modern Slavery Act, any British university over 36 million turnover, which is most, would need to think carefully about anything they build anywhere, right? Whether it's in the UK or otherwise, and what are the conditions under which those buildings were constructed. The other area of work that's really interesting is around Olympics, for example. So Olympics, the work by Bent Fleurberg is amazing on how much it costs per Olympics and the promise of those things. And if you look at London 2012, there was this great promise of healing that part of London. But what ended up happening is that on this side of the tracks, you get a massive investment. On that side of the tracks, you get nothing, right? So that promise was unfulfilled. And other Olympic venues and sporting venues, particularly in certain countries, are using unpaid labor, right, under horrible conditions. I didn't know about the NYU case, so I'm going to go look at that, because I don't think they're isolated.
Okay, question.
And sorry, the last thing she said was in a way unwitting, right? They may not have known, but it is absolutely their responsibility to ask the right questions.
I mean, the reports that I've seen was that they shut down professors that were trying to investigate.
Okay, so that's a much deeper problem then. Yeah, okay, thank you.
How much of this is a question of choice? Because if I think in the UK context, we have the capability to identify all the male bars and all of the potential brothels or whatever. So we have that ability.
Yep.
We so choose. So that's the identification. We have the ability to go in and enforce on all of those sites if we so chose. We then have the ability to process or investigate each of those cases within the judiciary if we so chose. And we have the ability to rehome or build homes for those people and provide jobs for them if we chose. But at each one of those steps, there's budget. And
Absolutely.
the choice is where we spend the money. So
Yep.
really, I think, for instance, in the UK, with the resources at our disposal, we don't have to have modern slavery if we choose to put our minds to it. But we are choosing to not spend that money, not allocate those resources to deal with this issue. So ultimately, it comes back to values and priorities and the government. So I think it's absolutely immoral.
Well, it comes down to politics and the mobilization of bias and awareness raising and agenda setting. So political scientists have been worried about this for a long time. And also when you have competing agendas in a parliamentary system, as you can see unfolding before your very eyes on a regular basis, how does an idea win the day, right? So we're delighted that UKRI have announced £10 million to do research on this problem. But if you look at the scale of what we're talking about, and just the scale here in the UK, that's probably not enough money, right? I would venture to say. Now, I'm not complaining at all. It's an absolute step in the right direction. But awareness raising, iteration, talking to groups like you, and all of us in our group talking to other groups, right? But that's about, you're right, the nail bars, but even raising public awareness through our car wash app, right? I had colleagues come to me at work saying, now I have to think about where to get my car washed again. Because they just didn't know. They liked the £6 car wash, right? I went to Tesco and got my car washed. The guy running it's from Kirkuk, and he has about 5 guys from Romania working for him. And I strike up a conversation about where he's from, what he's doing, who's working for him. Just, I wasn't investigating. But it raises a number of questions and raises awareness. And even Tesco wasn't really sure. They saw it as, this is great for our customers because they can have the car wash while they shop. And the car washers say, ooh, that might take 45 minutes. So Tesco loves that because then you're in the shop longer. And that means you buy more stuff, right? And that logic was quite interesting. But then when you have a car wash app that's reporting directly into an archive that then gets investigated, Tesco thinks, hang on a minute, that car wash is a bit of a liability. The question then is, does it get pushed off-site and other things? The other thing we've thought about is that the car washes aren't making money, but they are a network for shifting drugs, right? So that if you get a car pull in, right, and they do the valet, well, if you're doing a valet in the boot of your car, slipping a packet of drugs in your car is super easy, right? So there's a secondary market of stuff happening in this network of things. So it becomes a larger criminal problem than maybe first imagined. But raising awareness and making that the top priority is politics, right?
Now, just to put it into context, that £10 million, we're spending 100 billion on HS2, which will speed up the journey from Boeing to Landman.
Yep, correct. And that shows you where the priorities lie. Yeah.
And locally, if you have a local community safety plan, they have to decide locally how much resource they're going to put into modern slavery versus graffiti versus parking offences and those kinds of things. And that decision making is driven very locally, but those big questions become too intractable.
So it turns out coordination of authorities is really problematic. So there's a total different coordination in each of the nations of the UK. So the Welsh do it different than the English do it different than the Scots, right? And we know how police forces are organized here. It's a very disaggregated system, right? And the NCA is kind of an overarching system. But again, coordinating authorities and working closely together with everyone is quite tricky.
Question there?
Just a follow-on about that app and the asking the questions of the car washers. What risk does that put those slaves in? If you're asking, and I think the question should be asked, I'm not saying but you don't know what minders might be watching those people, and if the encouragement is for just general people to be asking questions about where they're from or what sort of their stance.
Yeah, no, it isn't that. It's when you've had your car washed, the questions are on the app itself that you ask yourself. So if you go and get your car washed, it'll say, did the worker arrive on a bicycle? Did it look like they're sleeping rough? Did they add workers during the time that you were having your car washed? There's a number of things there. You're not actually doing what I did with my man at Tesco. I was just, being friendly and curious, but at the same time, had the radar up just to see what was actually happening there. So the app itself is a self-reporting tool. There is risk. There's always risk. There's risk of false identification. This happens all the time with crime reporting and Crime Stoppers. And big case at the moment in the States is with facilitated communication, for example, leading to wrongful conviction of parents and sex abuse. It's that bad, right? But there's also an upside to at least gathering a sense of where these things are happening and raising awareness about the issue. But there's an ethical dilemma there for sure. But if we all kept our heads down, didn't bother anyone, we wouldn't be in this room.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you.